Okay, last week, I think it was last week, kind of informally indicated that there was one matter left, and there were some statements that Mr. Jones made that the state wanted precluded. And I indicated that I couldn't make a decision because I had not reviewed the video and audio tape. So I reviewed the video and audio tape from the officer's car, and then the officer, was it Park?
Officer Park, yeah.
His body cam, the audio was working, but the video didn't play. I just got the audio. Is that consistent?
No, it should have been playing
Okay.
on our computer before we brought it.
Okay. Well, I listened to the audio, and I think that was probably the portion that I really need to hear. So I am determining, there was a statement that Mr. Jones made. He, quote, "I thought I was going to die." And then there were 3 why statements that I heard in the car. And I'm going to rule that those are self-serving hearsay statements that cannot be brought in through another witness in that case. Let's go off the record for a second. Do we have everybody? Mr. Barker, go ahead, sir.
Thank you, Judge. The defendant, Stephen Jones, murdered a young man and seriously injured 3 others because his pride was hurt. In the early morning hours of October 9th, 2015, the defendant was confronted by a group of college students, and he was punched 1 time in the face. Instead of punching back or walking away altogether, the defendant went to his car to get his gun, a fully loaded .40 caliber handgun, and then he went another 90 feet back toward that group to shoot 4 unarmed college students. Now, these college students were Nick Peering, Nick Prado, Kyle Zentek, and Colin Brew. The defendant shot Nick Peering twice, once in his arm and once in his hip. He shot Nick Prado once through his neck. He shot Kyle Zentek twice in his back as Kyle was running away. Now, miraculously, these 3 victims survived. Sadly, Colin Brew did not survive the defendant's rampage. The defendant shot Colin twice in his torso, lacerating vessels to his heart, causing massive internal bleeding. Colin died within minutes after the defendant shot him. Now, before this night, none of these victims knew the defendant, never associated with him, didn't know him to like him or dislike him. But that night, to the victims, the defendant was an assassin emerging from the darkness, and they had no chance to protect themselves before the defendant unloaded 10 rounds from his gun and changed their lives forever. All this because the defendant wanted payback. Now, ladies and gentlemen, during this trial, you will learn that what the defendant did was not an accident. It was not self-defense. This was aggravated assault, and it was premeditated murder. Now, earlier that night, the defendant and 3 of his friends decided to go to a party off campus, off NAU campus, Northern Arizona University. And the defendant's 3 friends that night were Shay McConnell, Jacob Mike, and Hunter Todd. All of them were freshmen at NAU, all of them newly pledged members of the Sigma Chi fraternity. Now, the defendant was driving that night, and he and his friends to this location. This is a 2-scale diagram, you'll see this during trial, of the parking lot where the defendant parked his car, and ultimately the area where the defendant shot the 4 victims in this case. The defendant parked his car here, and then he and his friends walked across the parking lot and up Franklin Avenue toward an area called the Grove, where the party was at. Now, at the Grove, like many college parties across America, there was alcohol, and some of them had some drinks, but nothing excessive. And at around 1 a.m., the defendant's three friends walked back down Franklin Avenue the same way they had come, across this area near the courtyard. Now, the courtyard was a location that right across the street from Mountain View Dorm, just off NAU campus. And at around that time, there was another party, a separate party occurring at the courtyard. Now, the courtyard housed a number of members of the Delta Chi fraternity as well as the Sigma Chi fraternity, the same fraternity the defendant and his friends had recently pledged to. Now, the courtyard also housed two of the victims in this case, Colin Brew and Nick Peering. Well, at this party at the courtyard, just like the party the defendant attended, there was alcohol. And you'll hear that the victims in this case all had quite a few drinks that night. You'll also hear that none of them were in a particularly bad mood that night. In fact, the party was pretty uneventful. At around 1 a.m. that morning on October 9th, this party was winding down. People were leaving the party or were just about to leave. It was at that point that the defendant and his three friends were nearing the courtyard area, coming down Franklin Avenue. And one of the defendant's friends, Hunter Todd, decided to leave the group and go into the courtyard to visit some friends. Now, he didn't tell the others exactly where he was going, and so the defendant, Shane McConnell, Jacob Mike, his two other friends, stayed outside of the courtyard area on Franklin Avenue, tried to get a hold of Hunter, didn't know exactly where he'd gone. And as they waited outside that area, Jacob Mike, one of the defendant's friends, had an idea that he thought would be funny, which was to go knock on the door to one of the houses in this courtyard complex and then to leave. Doorbell ditch. Nothing sinister, just a little prank. And so he did. He knocked on the door to one of these houses, and then he and the defendant and Shane McConnell, the other friend, started walking across the street. At this point, the door to that house opened, and a group or a handful of college students came out into the street, and they confronted the defendant and his two friends, asked them what they were doing there. Now, it didn't appear that either group knew each other, but as sometimes happens with young men, especially when alcohol is involved, tempers began to flare. And there were some words exchanged and chest puffing in the street. And pretty soon these two groups were squared off in the road in this approximate area, and it looked like a fight might break out. At this point, one of the partygoers from the courtyard area ran up and punched the defendant in the face. Now, you'll hear during trial that there was only one person that punched anybody in the face that night, and it was Austin Contreras, who is not one of the victims in this case. Now, it's unclear why Austin decided to do that, but he did, and after he punched the defendant in the face, he ran off from that area, had no further interaction with that confrontation. Now, it's important to understand that at this point, of the four victims the defendant shot that night, only one of them had anything to do with this initial confrontation, Colin Brew. But it's unclear what, if anything, Colin did. Was he near the defendant? Did he say anything to the defendant? Did he even touch the defendant? These questions we won't be able to ask Colin because Now, meanwhile, this group in the street migrated onto the sidewalk that separated Mountain View Dorm from this parking lot area. And the words were going back and forth. But they weren't overly aggressive. In fact, the words being exchanged were words to the effect of, "Get out of here," mixed with some profanity. Nobody was punching anybody, kicking anyone. There was nobody surrounded. People in Mountain View Dorm actually were now watching this interaction. They could hear the argument happening. And they'll also testify in this case that they didn't see any physical interaction. It was merely a verbal argument. The dynamic of that situation was about to change drastically when the defendant got to his car. You'll see this photo during trial. This is the defendant's car, parked in that same stall indicated in the diagram before. When the defendant got to his car, he didn't stay there. He didn't drive away. He reached into his glove box and he pulled out his handgun. You'll see this as well. This is the defendant's handgun retrieved at the scene, .40 caliber. It had a magazine extender on it, which meant he could shoot up to 17 rounds. It had a light attached to it that you can see here, which allowed him to shoot in the dark. The other advantage this light gave him was that it would blind his targets. The defendant chambered around, racked that gun, turned on that light attached to his gun. He was armed for battle. But it was a battle only he knew about. You see, while he was in his car, there was nobody around. He was alone. He was a man on an island. And while he was in his car, there was no threat to his safety. In fact, with that gun in his hand, he was the most deadly person in sight. Well, the defendant decided at that point that he was not going to stay in his car. He was going to walk across that parking lot. And it's hard to see in this photograph because it was taken at night. But you see the defendant's car in the foreground, and you see lights on a building in the background. Those are lights on Mountain View Dorm. He walked across this dark parking lot approximately 90 feet toward the corner where this group was arguing. Again, having a verbal argument. Colin Brew was in that approximate location on the sidewalk. He was not fighting anybody, not punching anyone. He had no weapons. In fact, nobody out there that night had any weapons except the defendant. Now, people could see the defendant approaching from the dark parking lot because of that light, and they thought somebody with a flashlight. Or maybe it was a police officer, or maybe a security guard. Nobody thought it was a gun. In fact, the defendant's own friends, Shane McConnell, Jacob Mike, will tell you, at no point did they believe that they were in a life or death situation. They did not expect a gun to show up. And yet the defendant approached. And nobody else knew what was coming. Again, Colin was in that approximate area. As the defendant approached, some people heard him say, the defendant, say something, although it's unclear what he said. One person heard, "Get on the ground," another, "Stop." Some nearby didn't hear anything at all. Nothing about a gun. Whatever the defendant may have said, Colin Brew then turned toward the defendant. And it wasn't 1 or 2 seconds later before the defendant shot Colin Brew with his weapon from just a few feet away. 2 shots in quick succession, a tactic known as a double tap. One bullet bored through Colin's chest, through his lung, through vessels to his heart, lodging into his spine. The other bullet bored through his shoulder near his neck, tore through a couple of his ribs. Colin fell face forward into some rocks that separated this parking lot from the sidewalk area. And he didn't get up after that. Now, these bullets entered Colin's body at a downward angle or trajectory, suggesting that Colin was leaning forward or falling when the defendant shot him. You'll see photos of this area. You'll see that this rock section where Colin fell slopes downward from the sidewalk down to the parking lot where the defendant was standing. One witness described Colin as lunging toward the defendant, although he later clarified that it was simply a step forward. Others described Colin as walking or taking a step forward with his hands at his sides. Everybody agreed that Colin was unarmed, that he had nothing in his hands, and that he said nothing aggressive to the defendant before the defendant shot him down. Now, in the moments before, one of Colin's friends and his roommate, Nick Peering, was approaching from the direction of the party, up that sidewalk. He could hear Colin's voice. He didn't know exactly what was going on, but as he approached, he could see this light Again, this light attached to the defendant's gun. But he didn't know it was a gun, just like many in the area. All he saw was a light. And as he approached Colin and the defendant, he saw the defendant shoot his friend, and he saw Colin fall to the ground. At this point, Nick Peering was a few feet away from Colin, and he jumped over a small hedge or bush that separated the sidewalk from the rock area. And as he jumped over that hedge, the defendant turned on him as well. Shot him twice, double tap, just like he'd shot Colin. One bullet went through Nick Peering's arm, through his hip. Nick Peering stumbled forward. He fell onto the pavement just a few feet away from where his friend, Colin, was dying. Now, Nick Peering will tell you that he was trying to get to his friend, his roommate, his buddy who he'd seen fall to the ground. But he didn't make it. He lay there in extreme pain, unable to move. Now, at this point, people in the area were shocked, and they were horrified. Nobody expected this. Nobody expected there to be a gun at what wasn't even a fist fight, but merely a verbal argument. Some ran to Colin's aid to try to help him. One of the friends that came to Colin's aid was Nick Acevedo. Nick took Colin's head and he propped it up on his leg, and he put his hand on Colin's shirt where his wound was. He could see the blood soaking into his shirt. And as he cradled his friend, he could see the defendant in front of him still clutching onto that gun. And he asked the defendant, why? Why did you do this? And the defendant said, I don't know. I don't know. Others went to help Nick Peering, who was in the area also injured, unable to move. He was alert, responsive. And people who had seen what had happened were now trying to figure out how they were going to get the gun away from this shooter. They had seen what he was capable of. They did not want him to shoot anybody else. People in the area, in fact, asked the defendant to put the gun down, but he refused. Now, the defendant's two friends, Shane McConnell and Jacob Mike, were there, and they saw what happened. And they'll testify in this case. And they'll tell you how in shock they were when they saw what the defendant had done. Shane McConnell will tell you that he kept wondering why the defendant brought a gun, that maybe he was on some type of rampage, that he had lost his mind. Shane McConnell decided to run away from that scene, not from the group they had confronted earlier, but from his friend, the defendant. Jacob Mike was also in shock. He saw the defendant shoot Colin Brew, shoot Nick Peering, and then the light of that gun swung over and it rested on him, and he put his hands up and he said, don't shoot. He didn't know what was going to happen. Jacob Mike will tell you that the only reason he was actually in that area was not because he was surrounded or because he was in danger, but because he was trying to get his hat that fell off his head. And then the defendant approached with this gun. Now, the people in the area who were now seeing the defendant with this gun, they were trying to figure out how to get this gun away. At one point, you'll hear that the defendant, after he shot Colin Brew and Nick Peering, he stopped and he froze. And then he crouched down and he looked at Colin's injuries, the damage that he had caused, and he put the gun in the back of his pants, tucked back there. And people in the area were thinking this is their chance to try to get this gun away from the shooter. And a couple ran up to the defendant, tried to get for the gun. The defendant was too quick. He got his hand back on the gun, and he pulled it out a second time as people scattered. And then the defendant shot off several more rounds. The witnesses in this case will talk about hearing two sets of gunshots. The first set of gunshots coincides with when the defendant shot Colin Brew and Nick Peering. The second set of gunshots coincides with when the defendant brought this gun out a second time. Now, in the moments before the defendant was pushed to the ground, Nick Prado, one of the victims in this case, was near Colin. attending to him, and he had the thought that he should get a good look at this person, at this shooter, so he could identify him to the police. And so he made a conscious effort to do so. He stood up and he took a couple steps forward and he looked down at the defendant, who was now on the ground reaching for his gun, and he saw the defendant look back at him. And he saw the defendant reach the gun out from behind him, pull it out, take aim at Nick Prado, and fire. Nick Prado heard the gunshot, felt the hit to his neck. He immediately grabbed onto it. He ran away from the area, back toward the courtyard to try to find help. Blood was coming out of his neck. He was getting dizzy. He was in shock. He managed to get back, found some help. People helped put pressure on his wound until the paramedics arrived. Now, after the defendant shot Nick Prado, you'll hear that he didn't stop shooting. He also shot the other victim in this case, Kyle Zentek. Now, Kyle was in the area when Colin and Nick Peering were shot. He doesn't have a great memory, though, about this night because of the extreme trauma that he experienced. You see, Kyle, when he was in that area, he was trying to get to Colin's body to see if he could help his friend. He recalls that the defendant brought the gun out the second time, shot Nick Prado, and then the light of that gun rested on Kyle. And he remembers distinctly that it wasn't sweeping past him, that it was directed at him. And Kyle knew that this was bad. And he turned to run away, and as he turned to run away, the defendant shot him twice in the back. Kyle kept on running as far as he could. He made it partway down the sidewalk before collapsing in extreme pain. Kyle doesn't remember the paramedics arriving. He doesn't remember the rush to the hospital or the emergency surgery that he had that night. At this point, the defendant walked away from the carnage to a nearby tree. A witness from Mountain View Dorm had come out at that point, and he hadn't seen the shooting from earlier, but he could see people on the ground. He could see the defendant hiding the gun behind his back like this, and he was putting two and two together. And he asked the defendant to put the gun down, that he'd keep it safe. At this point, officers were on their way. Sirens could be heard in the air. And after the defendant shooted 4 unarmed kids, and without any options, he put the gun down, and he walked away from that scene. Police converged on the area. One of the first officers to arrive was Officer Park from NAU PD. He found the defendant walking toward him, hands up in the air, identified himself as the shooter. Officer Park put him in handcuffs. He put him in the back of his patrol car so he could attend to the wounded. You see, when the police arrived, they didn't have much information. They had information that there was an active shooter on campus, but they didn't know who was wounded or how many. And when they got there, it was a battle scene. Nick Prado was lying on a kitchen floor, clutching his neck. Kyle Zentek was writhing in pain on a sidewalk. Nick Peering was on his back, unable to move. Colin Brew was motionless on the rocks. The police tried doing CPR on Colin, but by the time the paramedics arrived, there was just nothing anybody could do. Colin died in the rocks, right where the defendant shot him. Now, Nick Peering, Nick Prado, Kyle Zentek were rushed to the hospital. Of the 3 of them, Kyle had the worst injuries. One of the bullets the defendant shot into his back pierced his bowel and also one of his kidneys. And he was sent to emergency surgery that night. Doctors actually had to remove one of his kidneys to save his life. He spent several days in the hospital afterwards recovering. In fact, the first interview he ever did in this case was in a hospital room while he was hooked to machines. Nick Peering fared a little better. He was shot twice as well, but one bullet went through his arm, the other through his hip, missing vital organs. He did suffer a fracture to his pelvic area, but he was able to walk after a couple of days. Nick Prado was lucky. He was shot through his neck, through and through, centimeter or two away from his jugular, from his carotid artery, which if hit at the scene almost certainly would have killed him. Now, while the victims were being attended to at the hospital, the police were putting the pieces together. They were talking to people who were there, who saw what the defendant did. They were photographing the evidence, the blood at the scene. And one of the things they did, you'll hear about during this case, was they took a digital scan of the area, which allowed them to take precise measurements. And because of that, we know that the defendant traveled approximately 150 feet from the point he was punched in the face to get to his car, to get to his gun. And then he had to travel another 90 feet to get to the point where he shot the 4 victims in this case. A grand total of 240 plus feet to get his gun and come back to shoot these victims. Now, while the defendant was placed in the back of that patrol car and he was sitting there, the officers were attending to the victims in the case, there was one officer, a deputy with the sheriff's office, who was standing guard. And he had a digital recorder going in his pocket, and he had a conversation with the defendant to try to figure out if there were any additional shooters. You see, they didn't know exactly what had happened, so they were asking questions. And he asked the defendant if he was the only one. The defendant said yes. And tried to clarify, "You're the only one?" At that point, the defendant made this admission: "Nobody else did anything wrong but me." Colin Brew's body was eventually taken from the scene. It was taken to the medical examiner's office for an autopsy. And the medical examiner found the 2 bullets that killed him. One bullet lodged in his spine, the other still in his back after busting through his ribs. The medical examiner also removed approximately 2 quarts of blood from Colin's chest cavity, evidence of the internal bleeding he suffered after he was shot. What the medical examiner did not find, however, was anything on Colin's hands, suggesting that he was reaching for the defendant. No defensive wounds, no burnt or unburnt gunpowder, consistent with the witness accounts that Colin had his hands at his sides when the defendant shot him. Colin Brew was 20 years old when the defendant killed him. He was a junior at NAU, excelling at school. By any account, he had a bright future ahead of him. He was just making his decisions. He was 20 years old. His whole life was ahead of him. And the defendant, Stephen Jones, ended all of that in seconds because he wanted to retaliate, because he was punched one time in the face. Ladies and gentlemen, during this trial, you will hear from approximately 35 witnesses. It's going to take some time. Many of these witnesses were there at the scene, saw the defendant's actions. But this is not going to be like a movie where you get all the information at once for easy consumption. You're going to get this information from one witness at a time and from different perspectives. People who were being attacked by the defendant, people who were running away or watching from the sidelines. And because of that, you'll be getting the information in pieces. But as the trial progresses, these pieces will begin to fit together, and they will form a picture of murder and of an unjustified shooting. This case is not a whodunit. There's no mystery to who killed Colin Brew, who shot Nick Peering, Nick Prado, or Kyle Zenteg. The defendant did. The question for you during this trial will be, what was the defendant's intent when he shot these 4 unarmed victims? And that's a question you will only be able to answer based on the evidence, based on the testimony you get from this witness stand. As we've talked about, and as the judge instructed you, it cannot be based on sympathy. It cannot be based on prejudice, one side or the other. It must be based on the evidence. Now, you've received some instructions already. You haven't received all of them. You'll get more at the end of the trial. But these are the instructions that you have to follow that will give you guidance in the law. And one of the instructions you got today was about premeditation, about what that means, how it's a moment of reflection before killing someone. And it tells you that moment of reflection can be very short. And that may be different than what some of us have heard about premeditation. And that's why it's so important to keep an open mind during this process, during trial. Wait till you hear all the evidence, and wait till you get all the jury instructions in this case before making up your mind. Now, after I sit down, the defense may give an opening statement. They don't have to, but they may. And if they do, they may talk about things I haven't talked about, things that may even seem important. But rest assured that at the end of this case, the state will have an opportunity to talk to you about all the evidence you've heard. Evidence that will include the testimony of the 3 surviving victims in this case: Nick Peering, Nick Prado, Kyle Zentek. You'll hear their firsthand accounts of how the defendant attacked them unprovoked. Evidence that will include the testimony of witnesses in the Mountain View dorm, independent witnesses who saw the defendant shoot on an unsuspecting group. And evidence of the time and the travel it took the defendant to get to his car, to his gun, and then to go another 90 feet to shoot the victims in this case. Now, what the defendant, or what that initial confrontation was juvenile. It was uncalled for, that confrontation in the street. There's no doubt. And sucker punching anybody in the face is just wrong. But none of those kids deserve to get shot. And Stephen Jones does not get to decide who lives and who dies.
Objection, Your Honor. Counsel's arguing. This is opening statements.
Sustained. Jury will disregard.
At the end of this case, the state will ask you to hold him accountable for what he's done. For the murder of Colin Brew, and for the shooting of Nick Peering, Nick Prado, and Kyle Zentek, and find him guilty on all charges. Thank you.
Mr. Davidson.
Thank you so much. You're welcome. One of the instructions that you've already been given by Judge Slayton is an instruction that what the attorneys say is not evidence. And while Mr. Barker tells a very good story, it's still not evidence. The only testimony, the only evidence that you're to consider in deciding what happened on October 9th of 2015 is from people who sit in that chair and are cross-examined by both sides. And you'll have a chance to assess their demeanor while testifying. You'll have a chance to assess any prior inconsistent statements they say. You'll have a chance to assess how their testimony lines up with physical evidence from this case. When you hear this case, you will find that this is not a case about an assassin emerging from the dark on a rampage. It's not even close. This is a case about an 18-year-old kid who was just a couple weeks into his college career, a freshman at NAU. And he found himself in a situation where he was surrounded, bullied, threatened, and attacked, and did what he had to do to protect himself. And he didn't have the luxury of hours or even minutes to make this decision. He had seconds. Mr. Jones was at a party with 4 of his friends: Hunter Thomas, Jacob Mike, and Shay McConnell. The group of 4 were returning down Franklin towards the parking lot where Mr. Jones's Mustang was parked. There may have been alcohol served at the party. What Mr. Barker doesn't tell you is that Mr. Jones apparently didn't have any, because after he was arrested, they took his blood and tested it for drugs and alcohol. He didn't have a drop of alcohol or any drugs at all in his system. As they approach this apartment, the courtyard as it's sometimes called on Franklin, where these other individuals were having their party, it occurs to Jacob and to Shay and to Stephen that Hunter's whereabouts are unaccounted for. So they decide to stop and try to call him. As they're attempting to call Hunter and see where their friend is, because they're almost at Stephen's car at this point, a group of individuals comes out of the courtyard. It's not a square off. It's not a friendly discussion. It's not a, hey, what are you doing? It's a, go back to your freshman dorm, you faggot freshman. It's getting in your faces. It's get the fuck out of here. It's people who Stephen perceived to be, quite accurately based on subsequent toxicology, to be very drunk, stating, I'll kill you, you fucking pussy. Now, I don't relish having to repeat these words. Stephen certainly didn't relish having to hear those words by people who were surrounding him and his friends. But this is what he faced. This is what he faced after simply pausing on a sidewalk in front of a house to use his phone to call his friend. And then out of nowhere, through no provocation whatsoever by Stephen, what the prosecutor characterizes as a childish and juvenile act, Stephen is sucker punched out of the clear blue sky, hard enough that his glasses are knocked off his face. Stephen doesn't see well. He requires glasses. This isn't a very well-lit area to begin with. Stephen heads to his car, which is across the street on Franklin. He looks back and he sees at least two individuals from the group that surrounded him and his friends that are chasing him. He's still worried about his safety. It's a young man who's just been surrounded, threatened verbally, punched. It's dark, he can't see well, and now there's people chasing him to his car. His Mustang's parked in the parking lot. Stephen has a key fob, sort of a wireless remote to unlock the door, and then a separate traditional key that's turned in the ignition to start the car. They're separated. Stephen is able to recover the key fob as he approaches his car from the passenger side, and he unlocks the door. Pulls the door open, opens the glove box, and he recovers his pistol. As he recovers his pistol and he turns to announce that he has a gun, because to his knowledge, these people, at least through his limited vision, through no fault of his own, are chasing him, he sees that their attention is again drawn to him as a result of him making that announcement, and they come towards him again. Stephen is aware that his friends Shay and Jacob are still somewhere in this group with these people who are less than friendly. And he walks over and approaches this group. Yes, it was 90 feet. But what the prosecutor didn't tell you is that this cold-hearted assassin who was on a rampage this night did not approach his friends who were being surrounded and fire shots. He did not approach his friends who were being surrounded and even have the gun pointed, leveled off at them. He held the gun pointed at the ground in what's sometimes referred to as a low-ready position. He approaches his friends, and there's Mr. Brew. Mr. Jones is holding the gun, not pointed at anybody, he's pointed at the ground. Announces he has the gun. He's just trying to protect himself. He's not shooting anybody at this point. He says, get out of here, leave, stop, get the fuck out of here, words to that effect. And in response to that, what does Mr. Brew do? He turns and he lunges at Mr. Jones. And it was in that very moment that Mr. Jones leveled up his pistol and fired those shots at Mr. Brew. And we know that Mr. Brew was no more than 2 feet away from Mr. Jones at the time that happened. And that's based on the prosecution's own medical examiner, because one of the 2 wounds that struck Mr. Brew had what's called stippling around it, indicating that it was anywhere from inches to a couple feet from the end of the muzzle of the gun. At that very moment, as Mr. Brew lunges towards Mr. Jones, Mr. Brew's roommate, Nick Peering, is running from up behind Mr. Brew. Mr. Peering later told the police that he was running towards Mr. Brew primarily because he wanted to calm him down, not calm Mr. Jones down, but calm his roommate, Mr. Brew, down. And in essentially that same moment, when Mr. Brew lunges at Stephen and Stephen lifts up his pistol, Mr. Peering comes up behind Mr. Brew in the same direction towards Stephen and jumps up from this elevated position. Mr. Brew and Mr. Peering are up here. Mr. Jones is down here. From this elevated position, Mr. Peering jumps up over this bush that's separating him and Mr. Brew. And then in that moment, after firing those shots at Mr. Brew, Stephen sees that there's a second subject who's also jumping at him from an elevated position and fires shots at him as well. Now, there's other people around. There's no question that there's people from the party across the street who are still there and who are associated with this group who started this confrontation. And what does this homicidal assassin on a rampage do? He tucks his gun into the small of his back. He kneels down and he attempts to offer aid to Mr. Brew. As he's down there trying to render assistance to Mr. Brew, a group of people essentially pummel him and doggy pile him. And they're punching him and they're kicking him and they're trying to grab his gun, and again they're threatening him, "We're going to kill you, we're going to kill you." And it was in that moment when Stephen's underneath this doggy pile, again being threatened, this time people trying to wrestle his gun away from him. He's screaming, "Help, help, help," repeatedly. In fear of his life, he fires multiple shots up in the air with the intent only of dispersing this group of people who are trying to take his gun and cause him harm. In the course of doing that, the evidence will show that Mr. Prado and Mr. Zintek were shot at that point as well. Now, after a resident of the nearby dormitory who had heard a commotion, didn't see anything, but he came down at this point, a gentleman by the name of Chase Jones, he walks up and he approaches Mr. Jones and basically tells him, "Hey, it's safe, you're okay." What does our rogue assassin do? He puts the gun down. Puts the gun down, I would note, having not fired all of those 17 rounds that Mr. Barker made a point to tell you that his pistol was capable of holding at one time. He put it down and he waited and he cooperated and he voluntarily turned himself into the police in a very peaceful and cooperative manner. Now, the state wants you to believe that that is reflective of a cold-blooded killer who premeditated his crime. That's for you to decide. And you're going to make that decision based on the evidence that's presented in court, right? And no doubt there were lots of people there. And no doubt there were people, fellow students, who saw this unfold from different perspectives, both physically and perhaps psychologically. And we're going to hear from them. And there's going to be some disagreement about the finer points of what happened. And it's going to be part of your job to sift through that and decide what the state has proven and what they haven't. But there are things you'll find that are going to be undeniable and are not going to be the subject of dispute. In addition to Mr. Jones having no alcohol and no drugs in his system, you're going to hear that Mr. Brew had a blood alcohol concentration of 0.285%, approximately 3.5 times over the legal limit. The medical examiner also found THC, tablet of marijuana, and Xanax in his system. You're going to hear from a defense expert named Dr. French, who's a professor of pharmacology down at U of A, and he's going to talk to you about the potential interplay between alcohol and sedatives, such as the Xanax that Mr. Brew had apparently taken prior to that incident. Mr. Peering also had quite a bit to drink that evening. His BAC was 0.208, just over 2.5 times the legal limit. Mr. Prado, Mr. Zintek were also over the legal limit. Mr. Zintek, I believe, was a 0.092. Mr. Zintek was a 0.181, over twice the legal limit, and Mr. Prado was a 0.092. 4 individuals who had quite a bit to drink. There's not going to be a whole lot of dispute that this was a very dark area where this took place. There's not going to be any dispute that Stephen had his glasses knocked off his face when he was sucker punched, because his glasses were recovered by Franklin Street, north of the parking lot. There's not going to be any dispute that Mr. Brew was indeed lunging at Mr. Jones at that critical moment when Stephen had to make that split-second decision on what he was going to do to protect himself. And the reason that we don't have to wonder about that is from the prosecution's own expert witness, the medical examiner. The examination that was done by the medical examiner showed that Mr. Brew had an entrance wound by the fourth rib, which is essentially by the nipple area of his chest, and that bullet came to rest in the 11th thoracic vertebra, which is essentially his lower back. So you have a situation where the bullet goes in by his chest, it gets lodged in his back. It's pretty hard to explain that away without having Mr. Brew leaning at a very aggressive, particularly given the fact that he's in an elevated position towards Mr. Brew, towards Stephen at that very moment when shots are fired. There's not going to be any dispute that the presence of stippling on by Mr. Brew's wounds means that he was no more than 2 feet away from the end of Mr. Jones' gun, if not closer. There's not going to be any dispute that Stephen suffered injuries as a result of this incident, whether it was from being sucker punched up by the courtyard or being pummeled down by the parking lot. The officers who had contact with him right after he was taken into custody noticed that he had injuries to his neck, to his head, to his back, to his chest, to his arms, and to his knees. The officer also noted that Stephen had a swollen wrist. Again, all corroborating that Stephen was attacked and he was pummeled, and that it was under those circumstances that he, in that split second, made the decision to do what he had to do to protect himself. You're going to receive additional instructions from the jury, from the court, before you go back and you deliberate, and there's going to be several days of testimony between now and then. And one of the instructions, or several of the instructions that we anticipate you're going to receive, is an instruction called justification, self-defense, and other justifications that provide circumstances under which a person can use lethal physical force. And the burden of proof at no point in this trial will shift from that table to this table. It will be the burden of proof on the prosecution to not only establish that Stephen committed a crime, but also to exclude that his crime, alleged crime, was not justified as a matter of self-defense or through some other recognized legal justification. So you won't get the exact instructions on what constitutes self-defense and justification until later on, but I'd ask you to keep that in the back of your mind, at least as it relates to where the burden of proof for that is as this trial progresses. There's things that will be unclear. There's things that we'll have to see how the evidence plays out as to those finer points. There's things that we know for certain. I talked about them. The wound path, the toxicology results. There's things that we're equally confident that you'll know for sure when this trial is over, and that is that this was not a case of murder. It certainly was not a case of premeditation. This was a case of a young man doing what he had to do to defend himself. And for that reason, we will ask you to return verdicts of not guilty on all 7 counts. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Davidson. All right, members of our jury, we're going to go ahead and recess for the night. Please get a good night's sleep. We'll begin at 8:30 tomorrow morning with the beginning, the presentation of the evidence and testimony in this case. So until then, please remember the admonition. We stand at recess till tomorrow.